we're going to pause for a week on the educational series of homilies that I've been doing since January, and the reason for this is because this weekend we celebrate August 6th, and August 6th is the Feast of the Transfiguration, the event that we just heard about in the Gospel according to St. Matthew. And most feast days that land on a Sunday, they get superseded by the Sunday celebration, right, the Sunday liturgy. So, for example, if the Feast of St. Anthony were to land on a Sunday, which it does every few years, we wouldn't really celebrate the Feast of St. Anthony that year, at least not in the Mass. But for really big feast days like the Transfiguration, there are exceptions. So instead of celebrating the 18th Sunday in ordinary time, as we would normally have scheduled this weekend of the year, we are celebrating the Feast of the Transfiguration, which always lands on August 6th. So we'll be using the prayers and the readings for that feast day instead of the prayers and the readings for the 18th Sunday in ordinary time, the readings that we just heard. With that in mind, today I'm going to talk about this event of the Transfiguration because I have people from time to time ask me, Father, what is going on in this event? What is this Transfiguration thing? What is actually happening to Jesus? What does it mean? And those are legitimate questions because there's a lot of little details that have meaning and they are significant, but the Bible doesn't really go to any lengths to explain those details. So that's what I want to do today, take a look at the Transfiguration, and we'll do it, kind of break it down line by line. Jesus took Peter, James, and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. So James, Peter, and John, they're the disciples that are the closest to Jesus. They follow him at the most important times in the gospel. For example, this event in the Garden of Gethsemane, as he's arrested, he is with these three who keep falling asleep. And these three apostles, along with Peter's brother Andrew, were the first apostles that were chosen by Jesus of the 12. Peter, of course, would go on to be the leader of the apostles, the first pope. James would go on to be the first of the 12 apostles to give his life as a martyr. And John was the quote-unquote disciple whom Jesus loved, which essentially means that he was Jesus' best friend, and he lived the longest of the 12 apostles up until the year 90 AD. And Jesus takes these apostles up a high mountain, Mount Tabor to be exact. I've been there, and it's a pretty special place. There's this flat, it looks like Nebraska. It's a flat farmland in the middle of Israel, but just sort of out of place is this mountain that comes straight out of the flat lands. And so it is significant. It would have been considered special, just as special it is today. And just generally speaking, mountains are important in the Bible. If you think of all the things that happen on mountains in the Bible, Moses receives the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, and the Israelites make a covenant with God on Mount Horeb. Jesus gives his most famous teachings in the Sermon on the Mount. So mountains are considered in biblical scholarship as places of holiness, a place where you are closer to heaven, closer to God in a way. Mountains are places where God reveals himself, places where God speaks to his people and teaches his people. It's probably the reason that he chose Israel instead of Nebraska. The next line, and he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. Now, people, with good reason, wonder what in the world is happening here. And what most biblical scholars agree upon is that Jesus is giving his disciples sort of a glimpse of what the resurrection will look like. Jesus and his disciples, they're on their way to Jerusalem in this moment in the gospel where Jesus will be arrested and tortured and killed in front of them. And in those events, Jesus probably, he knows what's going to happen. And so, what would his disciples think then? What of all the promises that Jesus had made to them? What good would those be? And so this event on the top of Mount Tabor was to give them at least some hope, some idea that he could be raised from the dead. Jesus shows them for a moment on top of this mountain what the resurrection will be. It'll be glorification. It'll be pure light. And we see this after Jesus actually does rise from the dead, after he's crucified. His resurrected body is different. He's able to do a lot of different things. And sometimes the disciples don't even recognize him at first. So there is something very special about the resurrected and glorified Jesus. And perhaps this glimpse on top of the mountain will give his disciples enough hope on Good Friday to not completely fall into despair. Yes, they run away. Yes, they're scared. But it could have gone worse. It could have gone the way of Judas. Perhaps this moment on this mountain will be just enough to give them a sliver of hope in the resurrection. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, conversing with him. Now, what are these two guys doing here? These guys from the Old Testament? Well, Moses and Elijah are sort of the two figureheads of the Old Testament. They're the personal embodiment of the scriptures in a way. They're personifications of the two major sections of the Old Testament. Moses represents the law, and Elijah represents the prophets. And this is how people in the time of Jesus would have referred to the Bible. Instead of calling it just the Bible, they would have referred to it as the quote-unquote law and prophets. And you see Jesus doing this in the scriptures. For example, he says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments. So, in other words, Jesus is saying loving God and loving your neighbor summarizes the entirety of the scriptures. Well, that's nice, but why do they show up? What are they doing there? Yeah, they represent the law and the prophets, but what's the significance of them showing up? We'll get into that in a bit. Then Peter said to Jesus and replied, "Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I'll make 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." So this might sound like a strange reaction to this event, but if you know the sort of culture and what these words actually mean, it is significant. So let's talk about it. So the word tent could be more accurately translated into a closer English approximation of, instead of saying 3 tents, you could also say 3 booths. A booth. And that's important because there's a Jewish feast day called the Feast of Booths. It's sort of like our Feast of Thanksgiving. It's a harvest festival and celebration and thanksgiving to God for his bounty. This is sometimes also called the Feast of Sukkot, Sukkot. Observant Jews still celebrate this feast day to this day, along with things like Hanukkah and Yom Kippur. They celebrate Sukkot. In the seminary, in Philadelphia, where I attended, it was located in a large Jewish neighborhood, one of the largest Jewish neighborhoods in the country. And so we would see this in the communities around the seminary. Each observant, and this is why it's called the Feast of Booths, each observant Jewish family, they make a booth, basically this little house, a little tent outside of their home in their yard, and it has lots of fall-type decorations. Usually lands in October at some point, The purpose of these little booths, these little tents, is that they were preparing a place for the Messiah to come, the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, to come. And it's important to understand that the word Messiah isn't just referring to a single person in the scriptures. For the ancient Jews, there were many messiahs. Messiah is a word that simply means God's anointed one. And so King Saul was a messiah, King David was a messiah, King Solomon was a messiah. Even King Darius of Persia, who wasn't a Jew, is referred to as a messiah in the scriptures because he is the one who freed the Israelites from captivity in Babylon. So Moses and Elijah are both messiahs in their own right. They're both anointed by God. And that's why Peter offers to build all 3 of these guys, Elijah, Moses, and Jesus, booths or tents. And it must have fallen around this time of the Feast of Tents, the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Sukkot. And so what Peter is doing here, he's saying that Jesus is a Messiah just like Elijah and just like Moses. That's how important he is. And he thinks he's doing a special thing for Jesus in this case. Until the next thing that happens. While Peter was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud cast a shadow over them, and then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." So God literally cuts Peter off mid-sentence, it says, And it's sort of a funny scene to imagine. Here Peter is all excited about building a fort, basically, on top of this mountain for Jesus and Moses and Elijah. And God is like, stop talking. Listen to him. Stop talking. Instead of doing what you feel like doing, listen to what Jesus tells you. See, the issue here is that Jesus isn't a Messiah like Moses and like Elijah. Jesus is God. He's not just another in a long line of saviors of Israel, of God's anointed ones. He is the fulfillment of all of those anointed ones of the Scriptures. He is the fulfillment of Moses and the law. He is the law itself, the new law. He is the fulfillment of Elijah and all the prophets. He is the one that they were talking about, all those prophets, long ago. So to build 3 booths for these 3 men would be to sort of completely misunderstand who Jesus is. And that's why God himself intervenes and cuts Peter off mid-sentence. When the disciples heard this, they fell prostrate, and they were very much afraid. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Rise and do not be afraid." And when the disciples raised their eyes, they saw no one else but Jesus alone. Do not be afraid. This is the whole purpose, the whole point of the Transfiguration, to prepare the disciples, to tell them that there is nothing to fear. Even when Jesus is killed in front of them, the Transfiguration was a precursor of what to expect next. This was something that would take the apostles plenty of time to come to understand. And Peter's words here are quite telling. They indicate to us that he hasn't quite figured things out yet, right? And who can blame him? He says, "Lord, it is good that we are here." In other words, let's stay here. Let's not leave. We don't have to go back down the mountain where the crowds that want to be fed are, where the Pharisees that want to argue with you and kill you. We can avoid all of that if we just stay here. All of that stuff that you said about dying, we don't have to go through it if we just stay here. So Peter quite naturally fears suffering, and that's understandable, isn't it? We do everything that we can to avoid pain. And I think that's why so many people they leave the church because they'd rather trade the cross of Christ for a sort of a pep rally for Jesus, some sort of feel-good message at a megachurch or something like that doesn't require anybody to make sacrifices or change at all for that matter. But Jesus is telling us the opposite, that we need to get down the mountain. And so that's why he says, "Rise and do not be afraid." The point of the Transfiguration is to prepare us for the cross. Because no matter how hard we try to avoid difficulty in this life, no matter how good we try to be, no matter how much we strive to guard ourselves against wrongdoing and evil, the cross is going to find us. If it found Jesus, it's going to find us. The disciples on the mountaintop were just beginning to realize this. And for us, who understands the difficulty of life all too well, we're in the right place. We can say the words of St. Peter, "It is good that we are here in this church." And we only need to build one tent for our Lord. The Hebrew word for booth or tent is actually tabernacle. And this feast is often referred to as the Feast of Tabernacles. So it's good that we are here, because when we come to the altar to receive communion, we become a tabernacle. We are the booth that Peter so much desired to build for Jesus. So remember who it is that you are receiving. Listen to the words of the Father. "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." At the Mass, we witness a new type of transfiguration where bread and wine are transformed into the body and blood of Christ. It is good that we are here. We don't have to use stakes and poles and tent cloth to build a booth for Jesus, because our hearts become the booth for Jesus, living tabernacles. And leaving Mass this afternoon, we will be carrying the presence of God within us. As I said, Peter and Judas, they had committed the same sin, the sin of betrayal. If Peter hadn't witnessed the Transfiguration, would he have survived the crucifixion? If we don't leave here with the life of God himself dwelling in us, would we have the strength to persevere through the challenges of life with our faith intact? Perhaps not. Judas spent a lot of time with Jesus and didn't come to that conclusion. So today, build a tabernacle in your heart for Jesus as we witness the Transfiguration for ourselves. And always turn back to those graces that God is giving you right now during this Mass and follow his advice. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him.